So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here as we continue our discussion on the topic of philosophical critiques of marriage. It is an honor to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Elizabeth Brake, who has so generously accepted our invitation to talk to us about her work on minimal marriage. Elizabeth Brake is a professor of philosophy at Rice University. Her research focuses on ethics and politics of marriage and the family, and she's the author of the book Minimizing Marriage, where she argues that common reasons for thinking marriage has special moral values are misguided, and that the value of relationships lie in interpersonal care. She also coined the term Mononormativity in order to address and challenge the widespread assumptions that everyone is better off in an exclusive romantic long-term coupled relationship, and that everyone is seeking such relationship. So our session lasts about an hour and a half. So if there are any questions, feel free to send us through our chat, and I will relay them to Professor Brake at the end if we have the time. Professor Brake, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you very much, Jade, for the introduction. It's an honor to be invited. I wish I could be there in person. I'm sure we're all wishing that right now. So I was asked to talk about my book on marriage. So I'll spend most of the talk talking about the arguments in my book, but at the end, I'd really like to update it and spend the last 15 minutes or so talking about minimal marriage in 2021 in the current political context and global context, but also philosophically responding to some recent work on marriage. So I'm now going to try to share my PowerPoint. So Jade, can you see the PowerPoint in the full screen?
Yes, it's here.
Okay, perfect. All right. So when I started work on marriage in philosophy, my starting point was the question, what role should the state play in marriage? And then more broadly in personal relationships in general? And that led me to the question, is there a good reason for marriage-like law? So as I'll discuss today, I think one of the main questions that needs to be answered is why not abolish marriage? Why does the state recognize and support marriage or marriage-like institutions in the first place? So is there a good underlying rationale, a reason or justification for marriage or marriage-like law, like civil unions or domestic partnerships? And if there is such a rationale, as a philosopher, I think it's important to be consistent. So what does that rationale imply in other areas of law and policy? And I'm going to argue that it has implications for paid caregiving, that it has implications for caring relationships outside what we normally think of as marriages. And finally, turning the focus from the role of the state to the claims of citizens or the rights of citizens, what claims of justice do citizens have regarding adult relationships? So in the United States, the Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed a right to marry, right? So in Loving versus Virginia, in which it struck down laws against interracial marriage, more recently in Obergefell, in which it recognized same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court has talked about a right to marry. So what rights or claims of justice do citizens have regarding their adult relationships? And I say adult relationships because here I'm thinking about relationships between competent adults and not parent-child or guardian-child relationships. Okay, so an overview of today's talk. I'm going to start briefly with a context of liberal arguments for same-sex marriage, which I diagnose as suffering from the problem of amatonormativity. And so I argue that even liberal arguments for same-sex marriage had a blind spot to certain discriminatory assumptions about differences between relationships. And in order to avoid this problem, we should recognize what I call minimal marriage, my proposal for marriage reform. And I call it minimal marriage because the entitlements of this marriage law and the restrictions around this marriage law would be minimal compared to the extensive benefits and extensive restrictions around marriage now. So as I said, I think the main question to be addressed is why not abolish marriage? I'll discuss that objections, and further implications. And then, as I said, I'd like to spend the last few minutes thinking about minimal marriage in our situation today. All right, so when I talk about liberalism, I'm thinking about Rawlsian political liberalism and liberal egalitarianism. So the underlying theoretical framework of my work and the arguments for same-sex marriage that I'll be discussing is Rawlsian political liberalism. So if you're not familiar with that idea, the basic idea is that within a liberal state, citizens should be able to justify law and policy. The state should be able to justify law and policy to other reasonable citizens. So political liberalism begins with the idea that we have ethical disagreements, we have different religious perspectives, and the idea is that even against the background of such ethical disagreement over what constitutes the good life, we ought to be able to give reasons for law and policy to fellow reasonable citizens. And so in giving these reasons, Rawls argues that citizens appeal to shared political values within what he calls public reason, that they can draw on shared rules of evidence and general agreement about scientific facts. But for our purposes, the really important point is what political reason prohibits, right? So political liberalism requires that policy in fundamental matters and important matters should not be justified only by appeal to contested religious and ethical views, right? So the justification for a law or policy in an important matter cannot entirely depend on a contested religious or ethical view, right? So for example, something like Roman Catholicism or Buddhism, it has to be justifiable within the broader sphere of public reason. And related to this is Rawls's neutrality principle. So what the neutrality principle holds is that in justifying law or policy, at least in important matters, the state should remain neutral between contested conceptions of the good, which are found within comprehensive religious, philosophical, or moral doctrines. And by comprehensive doctrines, Rawls means doctrines which apply to the whole of life, so which would answer questions such as, what is human flourishing? What is human excellence? What is a good human life? So the state should remain neutral between those different conceptions of the good. Okay, so what does this aspiration to neutrality imply for marriage law? So in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a spate of work in political philosophy arguing that liberal neutrality would require same-sex marriage. So I want to look briefly at how these arguments go. There were a number of such arguments, and here I'm featuring one by Adrian Wellington and Rafe Wedgwood, who both made very similar, structurally similar arguments for same-sex marriage. So the basic idea is that marriage law performs a certain function. It recognizes adult relationships that have certain features. So Wedgwood characterized those features as economic and domestic cooperation, sexual intimacy, and voluntary commitment. Wellington characterized them slightly differently, as involving a voluntary, intimate relationship, and he stipulates a romantic relationship as opposed to a friendship. And then their argument proceeds to say, look, same-sex relationships also have these features, which are recognized through marriage. And so same-sex relationships are relevantly similar. Equal treatment requires that there's some good reason for treating them differently, right? Otherwise, it's just unjust, illiberal discrimination, right? So their argument is, if you look at the reasons they're given for treating same-sex relationships differently, those are typically moral or even religious reasons, right? So ideas like same-sex relationships are less valuable or morally prohibited or prohibited by God or something like that. But neutrality prohibits appeal to ethical and religious reasons, right? So that's the aspiration of neutrality that I just mentioned. So they argue, look, if same-sex relationships are excluded from the benefits of marriage only because of these ethical and religious reasons, which neutrality precludes, it prohibits appeal to, the neutrality prohibits discrimination against same-sex relationships. So neutrality together with equal treatment require that marriage recognize same-sex marriage as well as different-sex marriage, so long as the reasons for excluding same-sex marriage are based on ethical or religious grounds. Now, of course, at that time, there was debate over the effects of same-sex marriage on children. So I want to set aside that debate about the empirical evidence because it's widely been found now. There's no evidence that same-sex marriage harms children. In fact, when we look at evidence for Canada, where same-sex marriage has been legal since 2005, it shows that the children of lesbian mothers are actually performing better on some developmental indicators. So an objection that was being made at the time concerned the empirical evidence. So there's no empirical evidence that same-sex marriage harms children, but I want to set that aside because there could be a different objection, which is that the purpose of marriage is to promote optimal parenting, and that optimal parenting involves different sex or biological parents. Okay, so one problem with that argument about the purpose of marriage, as Wedgwood and Wellington point out, is, look, if we look at how marriage actually functions, people are not required to be fertile to enter marriage. They're not required to intend to procreate. So marriage law clearly serves functions other than procreation and parenting. However, an objector could respond, well, wait a second. Marriage law now does serve those other functions, but it should be designed to promote the optimal parenting situation. But here I think there are two important responses. One is, look, if the thought is that marriage benefits children through the legal entitlements and the social regard which marriage provides, then extending marriage to more parents will benefit the children in those marriages. And another objection that I think is very important is, at least in the US, a large percentage of children are being raised outside marriage, more than 50% of children. And so separate parenting frameworks promoting children's welfare would be more efficient and more targeted, more likely to benefit children than trying to benefit them indirectly through marriage, which, by the way, in cases of high conflict marriage, can actually be harmful to children. Okay, so what I argue in the book is we should separate the questions of legal frameworks for relationships between consenting adults and legal frameworks for parenting, which are designed to benefit children. Okay, so going back to those arguments for same-sex marriage, I agree with arguments such as Wedgwood's and Wellington's as far as they go. But the problem is that they don't go far enough in examining the implications of their own neutrality reasoning for marriage, because they still assume that the marriage framework, the framework for adult relationships, should be monogamous, that it should be romantic and sexual, that it should be exclusive, it should include only two people, it should include a relationship which is central to the party's life and excludes all others. But this itself is a contested ideal of relationship, right? So many people have comprehensive conceptions of the good, which pursue different visions of the relationship, whether they're asexuals, whether they're people who pursue polygamy or polyamory, whether they're people who would prefer to have multiple sexual relationships serially. People have different ideals of relationship. So the reasoning for same-sex marriage still assumes a comprehensive ethical ideal of a monogamous, romantic, exclusive, central relationship as deserving the benefits of marriage. So in other words, and so this is part two, same-sex marriage still involves discrimination against singles. And by singles, I don't just mean people who are not legally married. I mean people who are unpartnered, who could be people in between relationships, asexuals, people who for different reasons have decided not to pursue a romantic relationship or simply not entered one. So even same-sex marriage involves a failure of equal treatment. It doesn't extend benefits to people in, say, friendship relationships or people in relationships involving more than two people. So it still fails to treat different relationships equally by privileging romantic sexual relationships and monogamy, two-person exclusive relationships, over non-sexual, non-romantic friendships, and over polyamorous or polygamous or other forms of multiple or group sexual and romantic relationship. So using the same reasoning that's used in the liberal case for same-sex marriage, if the reason those relationships are excluded from the benefits of marriage is the ethical belief that those relationships are not of the same value as monogamous romantic relationships, then their exclusion is unjust for the very same reason that the exclusion of gays and lesbians or same-sex couples from marriage is unjust. Okay, so to describe this form of discrimination, I coined the term amatonormativity. So amatonormativity actually refers to two beliefs. There's a descriptive and a prescriptive belief. So the descriptive belief is a belief that describes how people actually are and what they actually want. So it's the belief that romantic sexual couple relationships are the norm, and people who aren't in them are seeking or would like to be in those relationships. And the prescriptive belief that they're normative, that romantic sexual couple relationships have greater ethical value or even moral value than other kinds of caring relationships which are not romantic or sexual, or which involve more than two people. So I think it's pretty obvious that the differential treatment of romantic sexual couples and non-romantic friends reflects amatonormative assumptions, that romantic sexual couple relationships have a special value that friendships are widely not seen as having, right? So if we look around, we can see widespread social discrimination against the romantically unpartnered, as well as against the polyamorous, right? So this is an international talk. I can refer to circumstances in the US. I'd be interested to hear about circumstances in Brazil, but there are many stereotypes against people who are unpartnered in the US. So for example, the stereotype of the adult male who's unmarried and unpartnered and who kind of lives in filth and orders pizza and plays video games, or the stereotype of the single adult woman who has many cats. There are these stereotypes about unpartnered or romantically single people, which I think we would see as really problematic if they were based on race, right? So there is widespread discrimination against people who are unpartnered, as well as against people who are polyamorous, right? This relationship type has gained greater visibility and more acceptance in the past 10 years, but is still often seen as socially unacceptable or even morally problematic. Okay, so amatonormativity is my term for these forms of discrimination based on the belief that romantic sexual couple relationships are the norm and they're normative. They're what we should be seeking, and other relationship forms have less value. But it's also evident that there are many other forms of relationship that people live in which have a great deal of value subjectively, is experienced by the people who live in those relationships, but also objectively, if we want to measure their value in terms of something like the care that's provided within those relationships. So there are close friends, friends who build their lives around each other, or groups of friends, what Ethan Waters called urban tribes. There are extended family members, sometimes in multi-generational families, who live together or live close by and support each other without being in romantic or sexual relationships. There are networks of people, so where people have overlapping relationships in which they give and receive care and share their lives. All of these forms of relationships are excluded from the benefits of marriage. But what I argue in minimizing marriage is these also have moral or ethical value. If we think about what's plausibly valuable about relationships. Right? So we can see that non-romantic partners can exhibit long-term care and commitment. So here's an example of what I have in mind. So this photo is from 2012, and this case became headlines in Canadian newspapers because it involved two women, a 73-year-old and an 83-year-old. The younger woman took care of the older woman who had dementia, and she wasn't a paid caregiver. They had cohabited for something like 30 years. They were close friends. Now in Canada, they actually could have married at that point, but they chose not to marry. Presumably they didn't see themselves as lesbians. And one woman was American and one was Canadian. And Canada deported the younger woman, the American woman, despite her repeated pleas. And the story actually did have a happy ending. She was eventually allowed to rejoin her partner. But the point is, these women showed greater care and commitment than many people in marriages, right? Their relationship lasted 30 years. She took care of the other woman, and yet they had no legal recognition unless they had pretended to be lesbians, which they weren't. Okay, so I want to underscore then the idea or the fact that even same-sex marriage excludes non-romantic friends as well as polyamorous seems to be based on assumptions about the greater value of romantic sexual relationships. And this is what I call amatonormative discrimination. Right? So the assumption that romantic sexual relationships have greater value. But also same-sex marriage assumes two parties to the marriage. So it's assuming that there are two people for whom this one relationship is everything. So they need to reciprocally exchange the whole bundle of marital rights and responsibilities with this one other person. Right? But for people, not just polyamorous, but people in groups of friends or in care networks, there are different ideals of good relationships, which involve more than one life partner. And so assuming that those who should have the eligibility for marriage benefits only come in two, right? Only come as couples, also reflects a non-neutral assumption. Okay, so what I argued in my book is that equal treatment of these different forms of relationships, friendships, networks, polyamory, group relationships, equal treatment requires expanding marriage-like entitlements to members of all of those different kinds of relationships. And this is for the same reasons that the state should not privilege male-female couples, because privileging romantic sexual relationships, privileging couples as opposed to groups or networks rests on non-neutral assumptions. And so it violates neutrality and political liberalism. So you might be asking yourself, well, what would this look like? So this is the proposal that I give in the book, which I call minimal marriage. And so minimal marriage is a kind of philosophical placeholder to refer to this proposal. I'm not that interested in the legal name that's given to this institution. But again, as I said, I call it minimal marriage because it would strip down to their minimum the restrictions on who can marry, as well as the entitlements that come with marriage. So minimal marriage sets no principled restrictions on the sex or the number of the spouses, right? So it could involve more than two spouses. So I say no principled restrictions. In fact, I think there's a psychological limit on the number of caring relationships that we can have at any given time, given our emotional and just cognitive capacities. And so that sets the de facto restriction, right? So if someone claimed to be in close caring relationships with 100 spouses, right, that would seem pretty implausible, right? But there's no principled restriction, or the principled restriction is just the number of people that one can maintain caring relationships with at a given time. And there's no principled restriction on the nature or purpose of their relationships, not that it be romantic and sexual, not that it be procreative. The only requirement is that they be caring relationships. And the idea is that there, as with marriage now, there are certain entitlements that come with marriage, and people who wish to enter minimal marriage can pick and choose which entitlements they want to exchange or transfer to their partner or partners. They can exchange them all with a single person, as people do in marriage now, or they could distribute them through their care networks or their polyamorous group as needed. And in an ideal liberal society, these entitlements would consist only in entitlements directly supporting caring relationships. Now, the reason for that, again, I'm working within the US context. If you look at American marriage law, there are more than 1,100 benefits that come with marriage at the federal level alone. And that's not even counting all of the benefits that come within different states. So for example, at one point, the state of West Virginia would give a cash payout of $500 to people who got married in order to promote marriage, right? So in the US, since 1996, we've had marriage promotion policies. So if you think about this from a liberal egalitarian perspective, does someone deserve extra money from the state just because they happen to formalize their relationship? That doesn't seem like a good rationale for the distribution of resources within the state, right? It's a better rationale whether or not the person is worse off. Right? They don't deserve money just because they get married. Another way to see this is healthcare, right? So in the US, many people depend on marriage in order to access health insurance, right? Because there's a law requiring that employer-based health insurance is also accessible to the spouse of the employed person because we don't have national health insurance. Well, why should whether or not you have health insurance depend on whether or not you're married? Surely, I think as a liberal egalitarian, everyone who needs health insurance, which is everyone, should have health insurance. Right? So the point is, in US marriage law now, there are many entitlements that come with marriage that don't directly support caring relationships. And in fact, they seem pretty unjust, right? Distributing health insurance through marriage is unjust compared to distributing health insurance simply universally. Okay, so minimal marriage entitlements then would be restricted only to those entitlements that recognize or support caring relationships, right? So for example, providing status designations for third parties, such as employers, right? So designating this relationship or relationships as one of the life-centering relationships that someone has. Things like burial rights in a veteran cemetery, right? That comes through marriage now, the right to be buried next to your spouse in a veteran cemetery. That recognizes the importance of the relationship in the parties' lives. Bereavement leave or caretaking leave. Right, that recognizes the importance of the relationship to the parties in it. And minimal marriage entitlements would also include rights which directly support caring relationships. Right, so the idea is to maintain a caring relationship. Generally, people need proximity, right? I mean, I think one thing the pandemic underscores, staying in touch with people on Zoom is often, for most people, not the same as staying in touch with them in person or through doing shared activities. So supporting caring relationships requires proximity. And so rights such as immigration rights, in-state residency in the US, often used to determine eligibility for tuition or other benefits, caretaking leave from work to take care of your partner, hospital and prison visiting rights, tax status regarding jointly owned property. This can protect a couple who've cohabited for a long time when their home has risen in value, so that when one member of the couple or the group dies, the other doesn't have to sell the property to pay the inheritance tax, right? So that's why that's important for supporting caring relationships and their ability to cohabit. So the rights that minimal marriage, or the entitlements that minimal marriage would include, are simply rights which recognize and support caring relationships. So these are some examples. I think the entitlements will depend on the context, right? So it's going to depend on not just the legal, but the social and technological context of the society. And so when I say caring relationships, I'm thinking about relationships which are characterized by mutual concern, right? Benevolence, wishing well for each other, taking an interest in how the other does, some degree of stability and intimacy, right? Knowledge of the other, which requires time to develop. And of course, because minimal marriage entitlements last for some period, they're assuming a certain amount of stability in the relationship, right? So I'm not talking about something like a one-night stand or, somebody that you meet on the train, but a relationship that's lasting long enough and over time that these entitlements, right, such as rights to be buried next to one another eventually, would be appropriate. Okay, so here's an example. When I talk about care networks, what am I thinking about? I think this is the way that many people actually live. I mean, there's data, more than 50% of women in the US now live outside marriage. That doesn't mean people don't have close relationships. It just means they're not married, right? So the example I give in the book is Rose. So we can imagine Rose cohabits with Octavian, right? They share property and expenses. They're not in a romantic sexual relationship. We can imagine they're both gay. She supports and cares for an elderly relative, right? So this relative, she could actually use caretaking leave or bereavement leave to care for this relative or mourn this relative. She has a long-term love relationship with someone who's not part of her household, who she doesn't cohabit with, Stella. And she has another friend, let's call him Marcel, who's a bioethicist. And she would like this friend to be the person who makes end-of-life decisions for her. And also, often married couples get special rates at institutions like the gym. She'd like them to have family rates because they often go together to the gym. So minimal marriage would be able to support such care networks because Rose would be able to transfer the different entitlements that are available through marriage throughout her network of relationships, as opposed to having to transfer them all reciprocally with one other person. So minimal marriage would support care relationships. It would also support polyamory. Now, with Normativity, I'm focusing more on discrimination against relationships that are just friendships, right, that are not romantic and sexual. But it's important to note, as I said earlier, that marriage also currently discriminates against relationships of more than two people. So minimal marriage would support polyamory. Polyamory simply means having multiple love or sexual relationships. Again, it can involve any sex of parties. It could refer to an open marriage, right? So to a couple that have relationships with people outside the couple. It could also refer to small groups, such as 3 people or 4 people, called a triad or a quad. They could be characterized by polyfidelity, where they're exclusive sexually with people in the group or not. But it's not polygamy, right? Polygamy tends to be highly structured by gender roles of one husband and multiple wives. Polyamorous tend to be highly educated urban people who are often motivated by ideals such as non-possessiveness, equality, and radical honesty in relationships. And it's also not promiscuity, because polyamorous tend to value love or caring and affection within intimate relationships. So minimal marriage would also support polyamory, right? So somebody could support multiple sexual relationships or a small group with minimal marriage entitlements, right? So again, so long as it involves consenting adults, the state shouldn't discriminate against these relationships. So again, the question is often raised about whether or not polyamory is harmful to children. So if people are polyamorous adults and they have children in their care, is that going to harm the children? And this is an important question, right? Because there's a lot of research showing that polygamy is harmful to children. But as I just suggested, polygamy is often practiced within very religious, closed communities, and with very gender-structured relationships. And it's often the conditions that are endemic to those communities that explain the harm to children. So most really tragically, or one of the very tragic things, young children or adolescents being groomed for polygamous relationships with adults, or young boys being expelled from the community in order to maintain the gender ratio. So it's really important when we think about harm to children to distinguish polygamy and polyamory. So there's not a lot of research on polyamorous families because they are closeted. Right, so people can be fired. There's even been one case in Florida of a woman losing her child because she was polyamorous. Social services removed her child because she had a relationship with two men. So the little research that we have has been done by a woman called Elizabeth Sheff, and is it summarized here in a 2013 co-authored article that she wrote. Overall, and so she studied it was a longitudinal 20-year study of not a statistically appropriate sample size, right? It was under 100 children. So it is a very small study. But the children that were involved, she says, didn't seem to be developmentally different from children in step families or children overall. So they had benefits from being in a polyamorous family, such as they had more adults to care for them. They also had frustrations of having more people in the home, having to share toys. So overall, the little research that we have doesn't suggest that polyamory is harmful to children. But this is important within political liberalism, because remember I said in political liberalism, people can appeal to shared political values to justify law or policy. So they can't appeal to some moral judgments such as polyamory is immoral, polyamory, is a less excellent form of relationship. But they could appeal to harm to children as a reason to discriminate against polyamory, right? So if it were shown that it were actually harmful to children, then that would be a reason for the state to treat it differently. But now that we don't have that evidence, and there's reason to think, again, that polyfamilies are much more like step families, which are pretty prevalent. Okay, so let me restate the central argument that I've made so far. If the exclusion of people who are just friends and polyamorous, people in groups or people in networks, from the benefits of marriage is premised on the belief that such relationships lack the ethical value of romantic monogamy, then their exclusion is unjust for the same reason that excluding same-sex couples from marriage is, because it's premised on comprehensive ethical or religious beliefs which violate neutrality. And because these exclusions are not neutrally justified, equal treatment requires extending eligibility for marriage benefits through what I've called minimal marriage. Now, the main question I think I need to face is, why not just abolish marriage? I mean, doesn't recognizing caring relationships itself rest on valuing a particular relationship type? Isn't that non-neutral? Right? So actually, a number of people have argued, based on neutrality reasoning, that the state should just get out of the marriage business, leave it to churches, and leave it to private marriage chapels, such as are often found in Las Vegas. So Jeremy Garrett has argued for this on roughly libertarian grounds about the way that marriage redistributes resources, the resources that are used to support it. Tamara Metz has argued that marriage is based on a comprehensive valuing of a particular relationship type. And so it violates political liberalism. It's illegitimate for the state to recognize it. Sunstein and Thaler argued for abolishing marriage on the thought that that would actually just diffuse controversy over same-sex marriage. There's a more recent argument that I'll talk about at the end by Claire Chambers, arguing for the abolition of marriage. So how can minimal marriage be neutrally justified? I mean, it's still giving certain entitlements, certain resources to people in relationships, which someone who's a hermit and not in any relationships whatsoever would not be able to access. How is that justified? So I argue in the book that caring relationships are Rawlsian primary goods. Okay, so what you need to, the background that you need for this argument. So remember, Rawls aspires to neutrality, right? But he still needs to give a theory of the good, right? So if the state is supposed to be distributing something, what's the good that the state is distributing? So he gives what he calls a thin theory of the good. So primary goods are goods that are needed to pursue plans of life, whatever plan of life you may have, right? So in that sense, they're supposed to be neutral because you can use these goods to pursue whatever ethical ideal you happen to have. And so examples would be the liberties, money, self-respect, he says, is perhaps the most important primary good because it's essential to pursuing any plan of life at all. And there are also what he calls natural primary goods, such as health. So they support you, whatever your plan of life may happen to be. In political liberalism, he redefines them as goods that are needed to develop and exercise the moral powers, right, which are a sense of justice and the ability to form and to have a conception of the good. And the important thing about primary goods within Rawls's liberal egalitarianism is that they're the basis for claims of justice, right? So they're the basis for roughly rights claims. So I argue that caring relationships are primary goods. Now, Rawls actually says in political liberalism that his list of primary goods is probably incomplete, and other goods such as leisure perhaps should be added to the list. Right, so there's some complexity about what qualifies them to be added to the list. But if we think about caring relationships, and I mean relationships, right? So interpersonal relationships in which people care for one another as distinct from material caregiving of the kind that's given by a nurse or by a parent. I'm talking about relationships, interpersonal relationships. Those fit the definition, either definition of a primary good. Right, so caring relationships are widely associated with psychological benefits, including self-esteem, right? And remember, Rawls says self-respect is perhaps the most important primary good. So those psychological, those mental health benefits are the type of thing that are normally needed to pursue plans of life. Well, caring relationships seem to be non-fungibly essential to those mental health benefits, right, for most people. But Rawls is normally needed, right? So obviously there will always be outliers, such as the hermit who doesn't need any caring relationship. But the goods that the state distributes are the goods that are needed by most people. And there's an overwhelming amount of psychological research showing the benefits of caring relationships for most people. Right? And there are also sites in which we develop and exercise our moral powers. So how do we get a conception of the good? Right? How do we develop our conception of the good and our sense of justice? Even Rawls acknowledges that tends to happen in families as we're children. And later, we develop them in relationships with other people. So I argue that caring relationships are primary goods, which means that they can be called upon, they can be used within public reason to justify law and policy, right? So they're kind of a neutral good. And they're also the basis for rights claims or claims of justice. Now, of course, you might have the worry about like, well, is the state going to sponsor dating networks or, OkCupid or something? So the state can't distribute relationships, but it distributes the legal frameworks which support and protect relationships, right? And those just are the minimal marriage entitlements as I've defined them. Right, so we can compare self-respect. And again, remember what it says, this is perhaps the most important primary good. The state cannot directly distribute self-respect, but it can distribute what he calls the legal and social bases of self-respect, right? Which Rawls argues are the liberties. So he thinks having equal liberty will be the basis on which people in a liberal society come to have self-respect. So the state can distribute legal frameworks which protect and support caring relationships. And those just are the minimal marriage entitlements. And again, as I've argued, what equal treatment requires is that they be distributed equally. Okay, so I'm getting to, I wanted to leave about 15 minutes to talk about 2021. So let me briefly mention 3 objections, right? So one objection I call the hermit objection, which is the concern, look, caring relationships are not a neutral good because there'll always be some people who do not value or do not participate in caring relationships. And so their value is not neutral. And again, as I just said, Rawls specifies that the primary goods are normally needed. And so the hermit objection is going to be a problem for any item on the list of primary goods. There are some people who don't value or need money to pursue their plan of life, right? So the mendicant monk whose plan of life involves wandering around with a begging bowl and not owning anything would deny that money is a primary good for him, that is needed to pursue his or her plan of life. So my point is, within Rawls's primary goods framework, within the thin theory of the good, caring relationships have just as strong a claim to be on the list as the central primary goods. Now, another problem is the practicality, right? So how do we prevent massive fraud? How do we prevent abuse? How do we prevent people entering into, 100 or 1,000 person marriages? And that's something we can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. I mean, roughly, I think there are some minimal marriage entitlements, such as hospital visiting rights, which are really not ripe for abuse. People are not going to, want to benefit out of visiting someone in the hospital. They're going to do it because they care. So in those cases, I think self-designation is appropriate. In other cases, yeah, we might be worried about people, selling citizenship through marriage, which happens anyway, by the way. But, we might be worried about that happening with minimal marriage. And so in those cases, there could be greater oversight as there is now. So another objection is this marriage, right? So some people, some philosophers have argued, have started with the goal of arguing for the correct definition of marriage, the correct definition of the concept of marriage. So my argument is not about what marriage essentially is. It's about why the state should be involved in personal relationships in the first place. It should be involved because it should support and protect caring relationships because they are primary goods, and that justifies a law that looks a lot like marriage. Now, again, there are questions about nomenclature. Should we really call this marriage? And again, I think there are reasons for and against that. We might want to postpone that to the Q&A. Okay, so 2 more points, and this is work that I've done subsequent to writing the book. When I wrote the book, I was really worried about the potential reductio, the reduction to absurdity of my view, that, well, you're going to require the state to run dating services and match people up. And so I didn't really address that in the book. But subsequently, I thought, look, there are some people in our society who don't have caring relationships. Imagine an elderly widow who is confined to her home. She sees maybe like a home health aide once a week. She's not very good with technology, so she can't Zoom. There's some people who lack relationships. And on my view, they lack an important, a politically important good. And this is actually a really urgent problem, right, as society ages. So one gerontologist has suggested using robot caregivers to satisfy elderly people's need for companionship. So in subsequent work, I've thought about, well, how could the state provide some proxy for caring relationships to people in this position? And I've argued for a care corps analogous to the Peace Corps in the US. So a volunteer position which would carry prestige and which would be paid, in which people, typically after leaving college, would enter the homes of elderly citizens, people with disabilities, and carry out social interaction with them, right? So they would be home visitors who would at least give those people the proxy for a caring relationship, right? Which is human contact. And again, as we're seeing in the pandemic, this is so important. Another subsequent thought I've had is about the position of paid caregivers, domestic workers, nannies, those home health aides who might be working in the home closely with someone, for dozens of hours every week. They're in a really interesting legal position in the US because they're seen as too much like family to qualify for the full protections of labor law. But they're also workers, so they don't qualify for any of the protections of family law. So they can be reassigned or terminated and lose the relationships that they were involved in, often with very vulnerable people, and also lose the specialized intimate knowledge that allows them to do their job well. So as you see, there's some quotations here speaking to the way in which domestic workers often feel very close relationships with the people that they care for, and often that's reciprocated, right? So I've argued that parties to such paid caregiving relationships have claims to access to minimal marriage entitlements if both parties agree. But perhaps in this case, we should think of other legal entitlements which would protect the relationship, such as visitation rights, legal protections for the kind of intimate knowledge that's formed in these relationships. And of course, we can't forget that is Ai-jen Poo, who's the head or has been the head of one of the main domestic workers organizations in the US, the power imbalance between domestic workers and employers is severe. And so these protections for relationships, I think, must be accompanied by protection for other rights. But again, the point that I'm trying to make here is the underlying rationale of treating caring relationships as a primary good has implications in these other areas, such as providing access to relationships for elderly or people with certain disabilities, or protecting the relationships of paid caregivers. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the context today, the political context, the pandemic, the philosophical context. So in the US, obviously, we've seen, Black Lives Matter protests, really devastating immigration policy, threats to constitutional democracy itself, right? So I think there's a challenge from non-ideal theory against the background of these kind of grave injustices, police brutality, structural racism. How much do relationship rights really matter? And then I think there's also a challenge from strategy, right? So one concern that we heard a lot after the election of Trump was, look, the left pushed too far, and pushing for same-sex marriage just created this backlash among conservatives. And so it's strategically unwise to push for this kind of reform. And I do take these concerns seriously. But I want to reply, and thinking about this, that a simple opposition between racial or immigration or class justice and relationship justice is misleading, right? So for one thing, relationship injustice afflicts everyone, not just whites. Right, so it affects bisexuals, lesbians, gays, asexuals, polyamorous, who are people of color. But also relationship injustice can be a tool of racism. So if we think about interracial marriage bans, family separation at the border, political attacks that we've seen in the US on single Black mothers, eliminating conjugal visits in prison where those incarcerated are disproportionately non-white. If we think about the harms of slavery, it included prohibiting slaves from marrying, breaking up families. The harms of colonialism included stamping out Native marriage practices. So again, my point is, I think this simple opposition is misleading, and we need to think of the complexity of the ways in which relationship justice intersects with these other important, pressing matters of justice. Okay, so another challenge I want to think about is the challenge raised in a recent book by Claire Chambers. Why protect relationships at all? So Chambers, as her title, she's against marriage. She argues for the abolition of marriage, including minimal marriage. And her proposed replacement, so Chambers and I agree, look, you can't just abolish marriage and not replace it with anything. You need to know about relationships for the purpose of immigration or taxation, like there are functions marriage serves that you can't just abolish. So her proposed replacement is what she calls piecemeal directives. So the idea is these would not be based on any particular relationship type. They would not be voluntary. They would automatically apply in different functional contexts, such as property ownership, financial interdependence, emotional interdependence, care, parenting, cohabitation, next of kinship, and sexual intimacy. So her idea is that that was a quote from her book, by the way, page 147. So her idea is when you engage in these kinds of activities with someone else, it will trigger these legal directives. So for example, if you own a house with someone, there will be a default legal directive that will automatically apply to how you split up the proceeds if you move out and sell the house. And so her response to me, she allows that protecting caring relationships may be neutral. It may be a good reason for policy, but it doesn't require marriage, right? So her piecemeal directives are practice-based, not relationship-based. So she, importantly, in responding to me, she wants to avoid specifying a particular relationship type, right? Such as a caring relationship, which deserves certain entitlements and protections. She only wants to look at the different practices. And I think that this is a mistake because I think that specifying a relationship type will be needed to clarify and justify the goals of specific legislation, right? So cohabitation, for example, cohabitation and inheritance tax provisions might plausibly be limited to cohabitants who are emotionally interdependent, not to real estate developers or business partners who share a domicile, like say they operate a B&B together. So I think that we need to specify the relationship type in order to give a justification for the legislation, right, as well as to clarify its content. So I think the pandemic has given us some lessons which underscore this, right? So on the one hand, we've heard a lot about loneliness and social isolation. On the other, we've heard about a global surge in domestic abuse where people are quarantining together, raising tensions in relationships, right? So the lockdown has led to people, particularly people living alone, suffering from loneliness and social isolation. There's a lot of psychological research showing that this isolation is bad for you, right? The tagline is loneliness is the new smoking. So minimal marriage would actually justify a right to contact with others in this situation, right? A right to maintain the proximity that's needed for a caring relationship. So some jurisdictions that have had strict lockdowns have allowed people living alone to see one emotional support person outside their home, right? So I think minimal marriage would support that. In order to support that kind of policy, I think the type of relationship that is a caring relationship must be specified, right? In order to give a rationale for that exception, in order to define the policy, Right? So people aren't being allowed to leave their homes to see their hairstylist or their tax attorney. They're being allowed to see someone who provides emotional support. And also, one of the features of minimal marriage is that by designating another person or persons as an emotional support person, it allows for ease across contexts, right? So someone is recorded as someone who is entitled to contact, say in the case of a hospitalization where someone is unable to ask for that particular person. So in cases of bereavement as well. The surge in domestic abuse, I think, suggests another reason for recognizing relationship types as such, and not simply functional practices. Because, so I've mentioned earlier, there's a lot of psychological evidence that good relationships benefit mental health. There's also a lot of evidence that bad relationships can be devastating to mental health, as well as in cases of severe abuse, threatening the physical health and even life of the victim. And recognizing relationships as such allows addressing relationship violence. Right? There's specific types of violence that arise in intimate interpersonal relationships. And so recognizing relationships formally, as in minimal marriage, allows identifying that violence and then intervening. Right. So, for example, some jurisdictions in the US will treat stalking differently if it occurs in the context of a romantic relationship, because they recognize that there are different features of romantic relationship stalking and celebrity stalking, which typically need different kinds of intervention. Right. And as well, discouraging bad relationship practices. Right? So discouraging, for example, coercive control, instability within relationships, also de facto promotes good relationship practices. Right? So in order to address relationship violence, it requires the state to recognize good caring relationships, right? So stable and low conflict caring relationships. Right? So this is, again, I think the lessons of the pandemic underscore the importance of the response to Chambers, that it's important to recognize caring relationships as such and not simply certain functional practices. Right. And so finally, I seem 2 minutes over time, so I'll just say this very quickly, but recognizing relationships as such is also reparative. Right. So in the past, polyamorists, lesbians, gays, bisexuals have suffered injustice. And it's only by recognizing relationships that the state can repair that specific injustice. Okay, so summary, takeaway, a just law of relationships should support and protect all caring relationships and promote care. And it should accommodate friends, networks, and polyamorous people. So thank you for your attention, and I would love to hear any questions. So there's my email and website.
Thank you so much, Professor Brake. It was a true privilege listening to you and getting to know more about your work. I believe your talk has already helped us with some questions that have showed up in the morning, and I'm sure we will keep coming back to your talk to solve some other questions that will show up throughout the week. There are some questions that I would like to relate to you from the chat. So Professor Eduardo, he asked, Professor Brake, do you believe it is possible to advocate the reformist proposal of minimizing marriage without embracing the core premises of political liberalism?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I do. So the reason that I start with political liberalism is because it's been very widespread and influential. There's debate over how exactly political liberalism should interpret it, but I think on many different interpretations of political liberalism, my arguments will follow. So I started with political liberalism in part because it's so influential within political philosophy, at least in my context, and also because so many arguments for marriage reform were being couched in it without seeing its full implications. And I also think it's important, political liberalism is very austere in the types of reasons that it allows into public debate. So I think it's really important to show, even if you're so austere with the types of reasons that are allowed, you still have to accept the value of caring relationships, even within this kind of Spartan framework. But yeah, I think that if you have a perfectionist position, so if you think that there are human excellences, most plausible perfectionist positions are going to allow that, engaging in caring relationships is part of human excellence or human flourishing. And so they would also support something like minimal marriage, because they would support the value of caring relationships. If we think about Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach and Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, she argues that that's compatible with political liberalism. Some people think it's not. But if we think about the capabilities approach, that includes, affiliation. I think it would have to include something like engaging in caring relationships. So yes, absolutely. I do think that within most kind of plausible mainstream political philosophy, there's going to be grounds to argue for the value of caring relationships and also for equal treatment. It's the other part of the reform approach. The other part of the reform proposal is arguing against differential treatment of different relationship types. And I think that's a very hard case to make without relying on really kind of controversial and implausible ethical views, right? So if someone wants to try and argue that the friendship between those two women who lived together for 30 years and took care of one another is less valuable than a romantic sexual relationship that lasts like 1 or 2 years, that just seems so implausible. But yeah, that's why in the first part of my book, I address moral arguments for marriage, because I want to address those kinds of arguments that might be made within a perfectionist framework that's focusing on human excellence, and say, look, within, if we think about what's plausibly of ethical value about relationships, right? It's something like care, commitment, concern for the other person, as opposed to, being between two people and sexual and romantic. Yes, so absolutely, yes.
Thank you. We have another question from Professor Eduardo, and he says, break, I know Jade wants to ask this question too. So how do you evaluate the reception of the concept of a mononormativity in the philosophical discussion about marriage, right? And I would like to add to this question a more general, a broader question that what do you think is philosophy's and a philosopher's role in naming social phenomena?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, so I've been pleased that the concept has been widely taken up. I think, one thing that I've seen, which likely would have happened anyway without my work, but there has been, the kind of backlash of, I'm thinking of someone like Robert George, right? So there's a book that he co-authored with Anderson and Gerges called In Defense of Marriage. So trying to give a defense of this kind of discrimination. So that's one kind of reception, is just disagreeing and arguing against it. I think that, so within kind of the type of political philosophy and ethics that I work in, within analytical ethics and political philosophy, I've been happy with the way that it's been taken up. If we go outside that and look more broadly at queer theory, I think we can see, well, there are inklings of this, if you think about like Judith Butler, right? When we think about Judith Butler writing on kinship, right? So there's already this kind of implicit critique. So some people would respond, well, wait, amatonormativity is already included in heteronormativity. But so part of what I think of myself as doing is like translating that into analytical political philosophy. But also I think it's important to have this term. So it might be that amatonormativity is already included in heteronormativity, but that's often not widely understood. And I think it's been really useful to people to have this term that focuses in on this kind of discrimination against relationships, which are like just friendships. And that's actually, it's been taken up widely, in like media outlets as well, which is a kind of bizarre thing. But I think what that speaks to is the importance of like having a name for this. So if you think about recent work in epistemic injustice, this book by Miranda Fricker, which is just amazing, and she talks about the ways that being able to name your experience relates to justice. So she calls it hermeneutical injustice, like not being able to name your experience is a form of injustice. And the example that she gives is sexual harassment, right? So at some point, like in the 60s, if you watch the TV show Mad Men, like women would see, I don't know if you're familiar with that show, but it's just a show in the 60s. And women would see, like, oh, their bosses are always like pressuring them to have sex with them. But it's not until you get, this term and then this legislation about sexual harassment that they can name that, right? And so it's important to have a term like that, I think, just to be able to speak the kind of, phenomenon that you're experiencing, which, in this case is an injustice. So, I mean, certainly, I think many people experience people who are unmarried, either the pressure, like, when are you getting married? Like, when are you finding a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And even like one of the things that has happened around same-sex marriage in the US, I think now like lesbians and gays get that same kind of pressure from their families. And so what naming amatonormativity does is to like give a word for that kind of assumption that that's what they want, that that's what people want, because not everyone is looking for that kind of relationship, asexuals, but many people for different reasons. But it also gives a name for like the differential treatment, not just in law, but socially, of different relationship kinds. So there seems to be this unspoken rule for weddings in the US that like, if you have a romantic partner, they get invited to the wedding. But if you don't have a romantic partner, like you only get one invitation because you can't like bring a friend. I mean, apparently this is some sort of unspoken wedding etiquette rule, which I'm not an expert on, but I've read this. But that's treating, that's amatonormativity, right? And it's, it's not an important thing in the context of a wedding, but it's an example of the way that there is social discrimination, which this then allows people to name and say, this is what I'm experiencing.
Mm-hmm. So that answers another question that I had, which was about how amatonormativity could be related, or if it was included in any way, in heteronormativity, right? And a broader question that I have as well is how feminist philosophy, because you mentioned queer studies, Judith Butler, right? How does feminist philosophy plays a part in your work, especially in your work about marriage?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I see my work as all within feminist philosophy. It's coming out of feminist ethics. It's coming out of, as a graduate student, reading the ethics of care, right? And then wanting to bring that ethics of care into the mainstream. And again, that's why I start with political liberalism, because it's using these kind of mainstream tools in political philosophy to bring in the idea that care is important, which is coming out of feminist care ethics. Often that's seen as starting with Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice in 1987. So this movement in ethics that it flourished. So there's care ethics, which reevaluates basically our moral concepts based on the idea that, look, there are these ideals of caring that are more associated with women. And those ought to be morally valued. but is also coming out of concerns about gender inequality, right? So again, if you look at, and we were talking about this before, but like this, the 70s radical feminists wanted to abolish marriage, right? They saw it as slavery, and that has really changed. I think that's like a less popular position, if it was ever popular. But there's a lot of feminist work, if you think about Susan Mahler-Oken in Justice, Gender, and the Family, looking at the way that the distribution of labor in male-female relationships disadvantages women, right? So the idea that within kind of male-female marriages, women are asked to do the second shift of housework, to do the really heavy labor of housework when they have children, to do a much greater share of childcare. And then in the US, we see that, even when people are egalitarian, that still happens. Once a child is born, the women do more of the work. And there are all of these background social and economic explanations for that. But so I think that marriage reform is really a feminist issue, because I think that the amatonormative pressure of women into marriage, or like traditional male-female partnerships, is often very disadvantageous for women, right? But that's part of what's being sold with amatonormativity, is this idea, look, the most important thing you can do is to be in this romantic or sexual relationship. And I think those expectations fall more heavily on women, right? Where, an unmarried man might be seen as like enviably free, where an unmarried woman might be seen as like having this empty life, even though like women who are single apparently do better on many indicators, which is interesting. But so I think amatonormative pressure serves patriarchy, in other words. And so that's why it's important to name it and to eliminate it from law.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I have one last question, and if there are some other questions that the people that are watching us would like to ask, you guys feel free to send them through the chat. I would like to ask you about a more practical aspect of your proposal, is how do you see the transition from the actual marriage law and marriage organization that we have to a state of minimal marriage, without leaving people that depend now on marriage law and that build their lives around marriage law as is unattended? So how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's part of, non-ideal theory, because obviously in like liberal egalitarian ideal theory, you can come up with these idealizations, but how would that actually work? Particularly, for many people who are like lower status, marriage might be a way to improve their status, right? Because they're seen by that, it's bound up with discrimination against unmarried people, is the idea that, well, if you're married, you're more responsible, you're more successful. And so people who are worse off might see marriage as a way to improve their position. So it's a really serious social and legal question. So when I was writing Minimal Marriage, it was during this time where same-sex marriage was not yet legally recognized in the US. And so it seemed like very open, a very open time for thinking about different reform possibilities. Whereas now, we're facing this backlash, and we have been facing this backlash, which raises these kind of political concerns about strategy that I mentioned at the end. But I think it would be a great improvement, and I think it would be an uncontroversial improvement if they had something like domestic partnership laws, which made these entitlements available to people who were just friends. And I think that the value of that would be widely recognized. It would help a lot by giving people access. And in my experience, as long as you don't call it marriage, conservatives are not really that bothered by it. It's that name marriage that's so important and so controversial. So just to give you an example, I taught at the University of Calgary for 10 years. And during that time, so in Canada, and during that time, it became evident Canada was going to legalize same-sex marriage. So I was in the province of Alberta, which is a very right-wing province for Canada. And they created this domestic partnership law, which is actually a lot like minimal marriage. And the reason was because they didn't want to have same-sex marriage forced on them. So they created this domestic partnership law that allowed people, I think it requires like 5 years of cohabitation, and then they essentially get most of the benefits of marriage. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship they have, or so it's limited to 2 people, but in other ways, it's a lot like minimal marriage. And so that was enacted by a very conservative province as an alternative to having same-sex marriage. So I think that the program of adding something like domestic partnership law for people who are in friendships or in groups would be something that is much more politically feasible. I think that abolishing marriage, would be very difficult politically, but also for the reason that you've mentioned. But I think if marriage were to be abolished, and this is the argument that Sunstein and Thaler make, if you just like abolish it, then you just get rid of this controversy over same-sex marriage. I mean, I think there are other problems with that, but I mean that is something I think would be politically, let's say, more palatable than just calling everything marriage, like same-sex marriage and different sex marriage and minimal marriage and polyamorous marriage. Is to replace it with something like civil unions or domestic partnerships for all. But yeah, I agree. There are a lot of practical problems that you're raising.
And well, I said that was the last question, but I have one last question that I would like to ask, because you mentioned non-ideal theory, right? And I would like to hear from you. What would be your ideal? What would be your utopia if you had to have one resulting from your work and your theory?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think the utopia is just that people are able to pursue whatever relationship types that they find congenial to them at the moment, without pressure to enter a certain type of relationship, right? So not having the pressure like to pair off, John Stuart Mill talks about experiments in living. And I've always really liked that idea, the idea of just allowing people to like experiment with different forms of living and find what's right for them. And so I think that what minimal marriage ideally would produce, over a long time, would be a society in which people are just able to experience different relationship types. Like, am I asexual? Am I polyamorous? And having the freedom, am I gay? Like having the freedom to like experiment with those different relationship types without social pressure and without legal discrimination, right? Because remember, people can be fired, like at least in the US, for being polyamorous. People can be fired. So it would give people the protection to pursue, and this is the kind of Rawlsian idea again, but to pursue, their conception of a good relationship.
Thank you so much, Professor Brake. It was a pleasure hearing from you and getting to know your work. I am really privileged to be in this position of talking to you. And I think we don't have any more questions, but we have some more time if you would like to add some final considerations.
Oh, no, I don't. I'm really honored to have been invited to this. So I would be interested just very briefly. I know you have this conference on marriage, and obviously the talks are in Portuguese. So what is the state of thinking about marriage in Brazil? And that might be a totally unfair question to ask you, but I'm just curious. Are people interested in reform, abolition?
Well, the feedback that we got, academically, right, is that this is a very new idea that Professor Eduardo proposed, right, with this event. So, and the people that we invited to talk that are from Brazil are really just starting to think about this topic philosophically. So it's, I believe it's an area that we are still trying to grasp and then grapple with. But we have a lot of unspoken rules about marriage here that we are trying to dismantle through other means that are not just legal means, but we also we have a comment here. There is no much discussion about these in public sphere. Yeah, and someone else commented none. So
wow.
we don't talk much about it, yeah, but we will have some legal scholars talking to us about LGBT rights later in the week. Yeah, but it's everything is very tentative now, and we're trying to introduce this discussion. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's, I mean, it's so important that you're introducing this discussion. And yeah, this is a wonderful, wonderful conference. And thank you very much for inviting me. It was great to be able to talk to you and Eduardo just through the chat function. So thank you very much.
Thank you for accepting and being here. And I believe we will keep in touch, right? You left us your email and your website, and I'm sure we will keep coming back to your talk to solve some of the problems that will show up throughout the week.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and please do feel free to email me, everybody, with questions. Yeah,
all right.
Great.
So thank you, everyone that was here with us, that asked questions, that added to the discussion. And we will keep having this talk throughout the week. We have another talk now at 4, I believe. So we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.